The Gemstone File has been called the most incredible conspiracy theory of all time and one of the most explosive documents ever published. It's a 17-page document from the mid-1970s that was written by a man named Bruce Roberts who claimed he was majorly connected to a group of rich, powerful people who ran the world. Because of these connections, he knew the true story behind the murders of JFK and Robert Kennedy, the Watergate break-in, and almost every other major event of the mid-20th century. And he wrote the Gemstone File to reveal the true stories behind these events and expose the people who were responsible. During its time, the Gemstone File was a pretty well-known document, and in a way, it was one of the first things to go viral before the internet. It first started appearing on college campuses in the mid-1970s, and people would make copies of it and give them to friends. Those friends would make more copies and give them to other friends until it eventually spread across the entire country. Throughout its 17 pages, the Gemstone File claims to reveal the hidden story behind the major events of the 20th century, and it is one of the more incredible things you'll ever read. Much of the Gemstone File centers around one person, Aristotle Onasis, and most people know Onasis as the guy who married Jackie Kennedy after JFK's death, but there is way more to him than that. His story is absolutely incredible. He was one of the richest people on Earth and lived on a private island in the Mediterranean Sea which was named Scorpios. It's a massive, ultra-luxurious residence that is simply amazing to look at. He owned an 80-foot yacht which was the biggest yacht in the world at the time and is considered the world's first super yacht. He owned 3 luxury hotels in Monte Carlo and the Casino Royale Casino, which was described as that era's most lavish casino. He also owned Olympic Airlines, a large airline from that era, and owned the Olympic Tower in New York City. His official story was that, in under a decade, he went from penniless to running a worldwide shipping empire that made him one of the richest people alive, but according to the Gemstone File, there was way more to him than that. Gemstone claims Onasis was the worldwide head of the mafia, the most powerful man alive. The real way he made his billions was by shipping alcohol into the US during Prohibition, then exporting opium around the world after that. He was basically the world's biggest drug supplier, and this actually isn't that far-fetched at all. The area that Onasis lived in was notorious for being the source of most of the world's opium via the famous French Connection shipping route, which inspired the well-known 1971 movie. The opium from this area was known as Turkish tobacco because it was so pure and potent. So just connect the dots. Onasis was ungodly rich, had the biggest shipping empire in the world, and this shipping empire just happened to be headquartered in the area notorious for supplying opium around the world. It's not a stretch at all to imagine that, like Gemstone claims, Onasis was the main supplier of the world's opium. But what's even more interesting is that Gemstone claims Onasis was the person behind one of the greatest mysteries of all time, the murder of JFK. The Gemstone account of what went down in the JFK assassination is a riveting read. It claims that one of Onasis's main associates in the US was Joe Kennedy, JFK's dad. 2 men made a fortune together during Prohibition by importing alcohol to the US through the ports that Kennedy controlled in Boston. And again, this isn't hard to believe at all. It's long been rumored that the Kennedys made their millions bootlegging alcohol, and entire books have been written about Joe Kennedy's mob connections. Gemstone claims that Onasis and his mafia associates helped get JFK elected in 1960, and again, this is pretty well documented that the mob played a major role in getting JFK elected as president.
Another well-worn trick was ghost voting, impersonating deceased residents of a precinct. There were even claims that Giancana's hoods intimidated voters at the polling stations.
Listening to the radio, listening to the returns coming in, it was obvious that there was a theft underway.
Kennedy being elected was obviously great news for the mafia. They basically owned him, and they had his father in place to watch over him and make sure he didn't step out of line. His dad was basically his handler. But something unexpected happened shortly after JFK was elected. Joe Kennedy had a massive heart attack that left him a wheelchair-bound vegetable unable to talk, and eventually killed him. So according to Gemstone, JFK decided to take a brave stand. With his father out of the picture, he decided to wage a war against the mafia and double-cross them. He knew all about the inner workings of the mafia, he knew who the main players were, and he knew just how powerful their stranglehold on America was. JFK installed his brother Robert as Attorney General, and they started arresting organized crime figures. And this did in fact happen. Convictions of organized criminals rose a whopping 350% when RFK was Attorney General. When Onasis realized he'd been betrayed, he knew he had to kill JFK. Gemstone identifies Jimmy Fratiano, Eugene Brading, and Johnny Rosselli as the team that killed JFK in a triangulated shootout. Lee Harvey Oswald was assigned to kill Governor Connolly of Texas and, unbeknownst to him, be the fall guy after the killing. So Gemstone says there were 4 shooters that day, and these people have long been rumored to be involved in the JFK killing. Eugene Brading was a major LA gangster who was on parole at the time but was actually at Dealey Plaza that day. He was photographed there and even questioned by police after JFK was shot, and he gave the fake name Jim Braden. He's always been a real suspicious guy to a lot of people. It's quite a coincidence that this California gangster just happened to be in Dealey Plaza in Texas, halfway across the country when JFK was killed. And interestingly, the night Robert Kennedy was killed, Brading was also checked into a hotel minutes away from the Ambassador Hotel. Johnny Rosselli was identified as the primary hitman in the JFK assassination in a book by Bill Bonanno, who was the son of the La Cosa Nostra mafia boss Johnny Bonanno. Rosselli was later scheduled to testify in a 1976 government investigation into JFK's death, but went missing before he could testify, and his body was found in the Atlantic Ocean with its legs cut off. So clearly someone didn't want him telling what he knew about the JFK assassination. And another thing that Gemstone mentions that's also true is that JFK was originally supposed to be killed 3 weeks before Dallas when he was in Chicago. This is an absolutely wild story. There was an assassination team waiting for him in Chicago when he was scheduled to attend a football game at Soldier Field, complete with a Lee Harvey Oswald type patsy named Thomas Arthur Valley. And the only reason this Chicago assassination didn't go down is because JFK canceled his trip at the last minute. I actually did a full video on this Chicago plot to kill JFK. Definitely check it out to learn more. It's a crazy story. The fact that the Gemstone File was written 50 years ago and gives details of this Chicago assassination plot, which hardly anyone knew about at the time but ended up being revealed years later, lends some credibility to everything that's covered in the Gemstone File. According to Gemstone, an old mafia rule is if someone screws you on a deal, you kill him and you take his girl. JFK welched on the deal he had with the mafia, so Onasis killed him and took Jackie. This explains the marriage of Onasis and Jackie Kennedy, which has always seemed like a really bizarre marriage to a lot of people. Jackie was only 39, she was gorgeous and rich, and Onasis was nearly twice her age. So this marriage, if you believe Gemstone, was basically a symbolic way for Onasis to take responsibility for the JFK death. But as fascinating as the Gemstone account of the JFK murder is, it's not even the most incredible part of the Gemstone File. The disappearance of Howard Hughes is the most bizarre, insane, incredible event of the 20th century. It makes no sense at all. You probably know the name Howard Hughes and the basics of how he supposedly went crazy and turned into a hermit, but there is way more to his story. During the 1940s and 50s, Howard Hughes was simultaneously the world's biggest celebrity, most well-known inventor, and most successful businessman. He was like Elon Musk crossed with Leonardo DiCaprio. He ran multiple billion-dollar cutting-edge companies, and he owned TWA, which was the biggest airline of the time. He was an avid pilot who set multiple world records for speed, and he built and financed so many casinos in Las Vegas that he practically turned the city into a gambling empire by himself. And as a fun little side hustle, he bought movie studio RKO Pictures, one of the 5 biggest movie studios of the time, and he produced movies. The original Scarface was among his hits. He also dated every famous girl ever. If you look at his Wikipedia page, the list of A-list actresses he dated is so long it takes up 3 lines. He was everywhere during this era, and then he vanished off the face of the earth in 1957, and no one saw him for 2 decades. He went from appearing everywhere to never once appearing in public, went from dating almost every major actress in Hollywood to never dating again. When he officially died in 1976, he hadn't appeared in public since 1957, and the most recent photos anyone could find of him were 20 years old. It was said that he simply went crazy, locked himself away, and stopped interacting with people for nearly 2 decades. But if you really look into this, it's such a ludicrous situation, it's really kind of shocking that people just blindly believe this. Something more was clearly going on here, and the Gemstone File offers up a different explanation for why Howard Hughes disappeared. Gemstone claims that in 1957, Aristotle Onasis and the Mafia orchestrated a carefully planned kidnap of Howard Hughes and took over his empire. They abducted Hughes and took him to Onassis' private island Scorpios, where they steadily injected him with heroin until he turned into a brain-dead junkie. He was held as a prisoner on the island for almost 2 decades, just in case he was needed at some point, and fed a steady diet of heroin until he'd wasted away to almost nothing. The story about him turning into a recluse was invented to explain his disappearance from public life. The Mafia then bought off, fired, killed, or threatened the important people in Hughes' companies, then installed their own Mafia-controlled team to run the Hughes empire. Now obviously the idea that one of the most famous people in the world could be kidnapped and held as a prisoner for over a decade seems pretty incredible, but there are a lot of really interesting details about this kidnapping in the Gemstone File. So first off, a group of 6 people that was dubbed the Mormon Mafia did step in and take over control of Hughes' companies and money around the time he quote-unquote went crazy, and they were basically the only people who interacted with Howard Hughes in the 2 decades he spent as a recluse. This Time article about the 6 members of the Mormon Mafia said the Mormon Mafia had quote unlimited direct access to Hughes and quote in short they controlled Howard Hughes after he supposedly went crazy. And a lot of other strange things happened with the Hughes empire around this time. Noah Dietrich was Hughes' CEO and right-hand man for 32 years, but in 1957, which is the year Gemstone says Onasis took over the Hughes empire, Dietrich was abruptly fired from the company. Former CIA agent who was majorly connected to the Mafia named Robert Mayhew took over the Hughes organization after Hughes quote-unquote went crazy. It was Mayhew who purchased so many Las Vegas strip casinos with Hughes' money. Mayhew was described as the most influential member of Hughes' inner circle after he went into seclusion, but get this, he ran Hughes' empire for over 15 years and never once actually met Howard Hughes. They only communicated through memos and phone calls. Johnny Meyer was Hughes' legendary press agent for decades who threw parties and paid off politicians on behalf of Hughes. But in a strange coincidence, Meyer left the Hughes organization and interestingly he started working for none other than Aristotle Onasis after he left. So it definitely seems strange that Hughes' longtime CEO was fired in 1957, the Mormon Mafia and Robert Mayhew stepped in to control Hughes' empire, and Johnny Meyer left Hughes and started working for Onasis. And again, since no one other than the Mormon Mafia interacted with or saw Hughes for the next 2 decades, it actually would have been easy to make up whatever stories they wanted about Hughes being a recluse and fake this whole thing. And if this is sounding like a James Bond movie, well, it kinda was. And this is another really interesting aspect about the information covered in the Gemstone File. So in the early James Bond movies, Bond's nemesis is Ernst Stavro Blofeld. He's the main bad guy. And the similarities between Blofeld and Aristotle Onasis are almost uncanny. Both men lived on private islands, owned high-tech yacht fleets, and are of Greek heritage. They both own a casino in Monte Carlo named the Casino Royale. Blofeld made his billions in the oil business, and Onasis officially made his billions by shipping oil worldwide. Blofeld is the head of Spectre, a multinational group of drug dealers, murderers, and oil men who want to control the world, and Gemstone says Onasis was the head of an identical group. And then there is the Bond movie Diamonds Are Forever. In the movie, Blofeld kidnaps a Texas billionaire named Willard White in Las Vegas, then holds White as prisoner on his private island, exactly as the Gemstone File claims Texas billionaire Hughes was kidnapped in Las Vegas and held captive on Onassis' private island. Blofeld even uses a voice box to mimic White's Texas drawl to give phone interviews posing as White.
Willard White speaking. Yes, Governor, I got your message.
The ideal kidnap victim.
No one's seen the man for 5 years. So who's going to miss someone who's already missing?
How clever you are, Mr. Bond.
And this also mirrors one of the strangest events surrounding Howard Hughes. After a controversy about a Hughes biography in 1972, an announcement was made that Hughes was going to talk to the press. This was a big deal. This would be his first public appearance in over a decade, but he didn't actually show up to the press conference. Instead, the interview was done by phone and a voice over a loudspeaker answered questions from the press. It was claimed Hughes was the one talking, but there was no way to verify it was him, and this would have been the easiest thing ever to fake. The whole press conference is just bizarre.
On the 7th of January, he gave his first press conference in 14 years, by telephone from Nassau to an audience of 7 selected journalists in a conference room at the Sheraton Universal Hotel in Los Angeles.
What's in it, but, this episode is just so fantastic that it taxes your imagination to believe that a thing like this could happen.
I understand he got paid $300,000 advance for the book.
That's what I've been told, and that's what we're trying to run down, because
People have always questioned whether this was even Hughes on the phone, and it doesn't make much sense that Hughes was supposedly a raving lunatic by this time, yet he sounds very clear and articulate on the phone call. It's also interesting that the author of the Bond novels was Ian Fleming, who was a very high-ranking officer in Britain's military intelligence before he became an author. It's long been rumored that he formed the plots for his Bond novels using top-secret information he had access to through his work. And you just wonder if he based Blofeld on Onasis because he knew just how powerful Onasis was behind the scenes. Albert Broccoli was the producer of the Bond movies, and he was a close friend of Howard Hughes. He claimed he got the idea for Diamonds Are Forever in a dream, which could be true, or maybe he was trying to disclose what happened to Hughes in real life through the film. After reading the Gemstone File, the main question is obviously, is it legit? Or was Bruce Roberts, the man who wrote it, just some random guy with an active imagination? So first off, Bruce Roberts definitely had a very interesting life. He was an expert in crystallography and was one of the top jewelry designers in Hollywood. During his time in Hollywood, he invented a way to create artificial gemstones. Gemstones were vital components of laser beams, which was a very important cutting-edge technology at the time. Being able to create artificial gemstones in a lab instead of mining them saved enormous amounts of time and money, and Roberts' artificial gemstone discovery was hugely important. Roberts then sold his technology to Hughes Aerospace, which was one of the main companies developing laser technology, and he began working with executives and very high-up people at Hughes Aerospace. Through these connections, he started learning about the many strange aspects of Howard Hughes and his sudden disappearance. It's been suspected that one of the members of the Mormon Mafia was Roberts' source for much of the information he covers in the Gemstone File. Bruce Roberts was also married to the daughter of the French consulate to Indochina. Onassis' involvement in that region's drug trade was well known to the politicians in this area, who were all bought off or intimidated into turning a blind eye to it. It's believed that Roberts' father-in-law also passed Roberts information for the Gemstone File about this region. It was through these unique connections into the Hughes Empire and the Golden Triangle drug trade that Bruce Roberts was able to learn so much about what was going on in the world. He began documenting what he'd learned and telling his friends. A writer named Stephanie Caruana read much of Roberts' writing, which was said to be hundreds of pages, and wrote a summary of his Gemstone File, which is the 17-page document that appeared in the mid-1970s that became popular. In 1979, Hustler magazine published the Gemstone File in an issue. Now, obviously Hustler was a men's magazine, but Hustler was actually known for printing really good investigative articles, and it was one of the 10 most popular magazines in the US at the time. So this feature brought a lot of attention to the Gemstone File. More recently, in the late 1990s, another really interesting article appeared that claimed JFK Jr. was interested in the Gemstone File and its connection to his father's death. The article claims Jr. was basically obsessed with finding out who was responsible for his father's death. And when he was given a copy of the Gemstone File by the author of this article, Jr. was going to print it in his newly formed George magazine, and he was murdered before he could print it. There's been a few books about Gemstone over the years, but for the most part it's been forgotten about. It's surprising to me how few people have actually heard of the Gemstone File because it really was a pretty big deal back in the 1970s. It's definitely a heck of a read, and if the information that's covered is true, the Gemstone File provides a really fascinating look into our hidden history and the people who run the world behind the scenes. So this video was just kind of an overview of the Gemstone File, hitting on some of the main points. I'll include the link to the actual Gemstone File document in the video description in case you want to read it. It's definitely a great read, really fascinating. And in my next video, I will go into more detail. I'll just kind of go through the Gemstone File entry by entry and go into a bit more detail on everything that it covers, because there's a lot in the Gemstone File that I didn't even get into in this video. It goes into the Robert Kennedy assassination, the Chappaquiddick incident, Watergate, a whole bunch of other things. So that video will probably be a bit longer, but I'm definitely looking forward to it, and we'll talk to you then.